They weren't rum-soaked wanderers chasing treasure on a map. They were something far more dangerous, free. Ex-slaves who refused to kneel. Deserters who turned their cannons against their own kings. Women who disguised themselves as men, not for riches but for freedom. And sailors, broken by empire, who built their own republics on stolen ships. For a fleeting moment, between storm and steel, they created a world without borders, without masters, without nations. A floating rebellion on the edge of civilization, real, raw, and terrifying to those who ruled the world. But history buried them. Their names were twisted into caricatures, villains in children's stories, drunks in tattered coats, symbols of chaos. Yet beneath those legends lies a truth that empires feared, that ordinary people, even outlaws, could build a world of equality upon the open sea. This is not the story of fantasy. It's the story of rebellion, brotherhood, and betrayal, of how the Caribbean became the cradle of a revolution that no empire dared to acknowledge. This is the real story of the pirates of the Caribbean. The Caribbean. Today we picture white sands, clear waters, and luxury cruises. But 300 years ago it was the most violent sea on earth. Every wave carried the greed of kings. Every island bled under the weight of empire. And every ship, Spanish, English, or French, sailed not for exploration but domination. In the early 1600s, the New World had become Europe's battlefield. Spain had plundered half a continent, loading galleons with gold and silver from the Americas. England and France, jealous and hungry, wanted their share. The result was a century of wars fought not only on land, but across these turquoise waters. And when the wars ended, something unexpected happened. Thousands of sailors were abandoned. Unpaid, unwanted, and armed. They drifted between ports like ghosts, their loyalty traded for bread. Empires had used them, then discarded them. These men, and later, women too, found a new purpose in the one thing the empires could not control: the sea itself. The Caribbean's geography was perfect for rebellion, hundreds of islands, countless coves, hidden bays where no flag ruled. It was here, in this chaos, that the first pirates were born. But piracy didn't begin as greed. It began as revenge. Imagine being a sailor who'd spent years under the lash of a captain, watching your friends starve while the officers feasted. Imagine surviving battles for a crown that forgot your name, and then being cast out with nothing but salt and scars. Wouldn't you turn your back on every flag you ever served? They did. And in doing so, they created something extraordinary: an accidental revolution. Ships that once enforced tyranny now became vessels of freedom. Crews who'd known only orders now voted on every decision. Loot was shared equally. Even captains could be overthrown. To the empires, they were criminals. To the men and women aboard those ships, they were finally human. This was the beginning of a new kind of world, one not written in the laws of kings, but carved in salt, blood, and brotherhood. The Caribbean transformed into a frontier of anarchy, a place where the oppressed became outlaws, and outlaws became legends. But legends, as history teaches, are rarely born in peace. Soon, the line between freedom and savagery would blur, and the very men who dreamed of equality would face the same hunger for power they had once fled. Before the skull and crossbones became a symbol of fear, it was a banner of defiance, the flag of the world's first rebels without a nation. 1. The birth of a pirate world. The story of piracy begins not with treasure but with betrayal. By the late 1500s, the Caribbean was no longer a paradise of discovery. It had become the engine room of empire, a glittering battlefield where the great powers of Europe fought for control of the New World. Spain ruled vast territories, its ships heavy with gold and silver from Peru and Mexico. These ships, the legendary Spanish treasure galleons, became the veins through which Europe's wealth flowed. But power breeds enemies. England, France, and the Netherlands wanted their share of the riches Spain had claimed. They couldn't challenge Spain openly, not yet, so they turned to shadow warfare. They sent privateers, legal pirates sanctioned by royal decree. Men like Francis Drake, who plundered Spanish ships under the blessing of Queen Elizabeth I. They called it patriotism. Spain called it theft. And so, a century-long cat-and-mouse game began, a hidden war fought by mercenaries, smugglers, and sailors who served whatever crown paid them best. But wars end, and when peace returned, it left tens of thousands of sailors jobless. Imagine this. Men trained for war, hardened by years at sea, suddenly discarded when their services were no longer useful. No pensions, no pay, no home. Only the endless horizon, and the knowledge that the same nations who'd made them heroes now called them expendable. Many turned to what they already knew best: raiding, smuggling, and survival by the sword. The difference now? They did it for themselves. These men, and later women, began to gather on the edges of empire. They formed loose brotherhoods, made up of deserters, freed slaves, and desperate wanderers. Some were sailors from the Royal Navy, others escaped servants or convicts sent to the colonies. Many were runaway slaves, seeking vengeance against the same colonial masters who'd enslaved them. The Caribbean, with its countless islands and hidden inlets, became their natural refuge. Its geography was a gift. Thousands of miles of coastline, coral labyrinths, and shallow bays that large navy ships couldn't enter. Here, the empire's rules stopped. Here, the sea belonged to no one. At first, they called themselves buccaneers, from the French boucanier, meaning hunter. They survived by hunting wild pigs and cattle on the island. But soon, their skills as sailors and soldiers turned them into something far more formidable. They began attacking Spanish ships, raiding coastal towns, and capturing the gold and goods that once flowed to Madrid. In time, they built something resembling a society, chaotic, dangerous, but strangely fair. In a world where hierarchy defined everything, the buccaneers operated differently. There were no noble titles, no royal decrees. Just men, equals, bound by necessity. Loot was shared by contract. Every man got a portion. Even the wounded were compensated. These early pirate bands became something empires had never imagined, floating micronations, bound not by allegiance to any flag, but by shared defiance. They elected their leaders. They voted on decisions. They punished greed and cowardice, even among captains. What began as desperation started to look like revolution. For the first time, power on the sea wasn't inherited, it was earned. And equality, brutal and imperfect, existed where civilization had failed to deliver it. To the kings of Europe, these outlaws were a nuisance, at first. But soon, their raids grew bold enough to threaten entire colonies. Spanish towns were burned, ports sacked, ships stolen and repainted under black flags. The Caribbean became a paradox, a place where the world's richest empires lost control to the men they had created. Piracy was no longer merely theft. It was a symptom of empire's decay. Every act of plunder was a protest against oppression. Every captured ship, a rebellion against the system that fed kings and starved sailors. But rebellion is never clean. For all their ideals of freedom, these men were still products of their time, violent, unpredictable, and driven by survival. Their world was a fragile experiment, one that would soon explode into chaos. Still, for a moment, they had found something the empires could not imagine: a life without masters. And on the horizon, that idea, dangerous, intoxicating, and utterly free, began to spread. From the coasts of Hispaniola to the island of Tortuga, whispers grew louder. A new world was rising, born from the ashes of the old. Not of kings or crowns, but of pirates. 2. The Buccaneers of Tortuga. By the mid-1600s, the Caribbean had become a chessboard of greed. Spain still ruled most of it, but England and France were closing in. Amid this turmoil, on a small rocky island off the coast of Hispaniola, a new society began to rise, one that would forever change the world's idea of freedom. Its name was Tortuga, the turtle. At first glance, it was little more than a rugged patch of land, dense forests, sharp cliffs, and a single harbor. But to those cast out by empire, Tortuga was paradise. It became the refuge of the forgotten, runaway sailors, escaped slaves, deserters, and outlaws from every nation. Here no king ruled. No flag commanded loyalty. And so they made their own rules. They called themselves boucaniers, after the French word for hunters who smoked wild meat on wooden racks, or boucan. They survived by trading smoked pork and hides with passing ships, but hunger soon turned to ambition. The Spanish crown claimed every island, yet left them poorly defended. And so, the buccaneers decided to take what the empire refused to share. They began attacking Spanish galleons, not for glory but survival. At first, these raids were small, desperate strikes. But Tortuga's population grew fast. Soon, hundreds of men, and a few fearless women, lived on the island, their lives tied to the plundered gold of Spanish ships. What made Tortuga extraordinary was not just its lawlessness, but its order. In a world ruled by hierarchy, the buccaneers created something revolutionary. Every ship that sailed from Tortuga operated under Articles of Agreement, a written code that determined everything: how loot was divided, how injuries were compensated, and how leaders could be chosen or removed. Every crew member had a voice, regardless of birth, color, or rank. Captains were elected, not crowned. Discipline came not from tyranny, but consensus. For men who had been whipped, starved, and enslaved under imperial captains, this was nothing short of rebirth. Tortuga became a living declaration that equality could exist, even among thieves. The buccaneers were rough, violent, and often cruel, but their society had a strange sense of justice. If a man lost an arm in battle, he received payment. If a captain hoarded treasure, the crew could overthrow him. Even plunder was shared fairly. No one starved while others feasted. To the outside world, they were monsters. To those on the inside, they were brothers. And Tortuga, their island of refuge, was the beating heart of that brotherhood. At night, fires burned along the shore. Men drank, fought, and told stories of freedom. Women, some enslaved, some free, became traders, spies, or pirates themselves. It was a world with no borders, just the code of survival and the dream of living on their own terms. But the empires were watching. Spain called Tortuga a nest of devils. France and England saw an opportunity. They began offering letters of marque, official licenses to plunder Spain's ships legally. And so, the line between pirate and privateer blurred once more. Men like Henry Morgan rose from Tortuga's ranks, ruthless, brilliant, and utterly unbound. Morgan would one day lead massive fleets of buccaneers to sack cities like Portobello and Panama, turning piracy into an organized industry of violence. Tortuga was his training ground, the cradle of the Caribbean's most notorious legends. But behind every act of conquest was a paradox. The buccaneers sought freedom from empire, yet many served new masters when the gold was right. They fought for equality among themselves, but they still raided, burned, and killed without mercy. Their dream of a just, free brotherhood was forever at war with their hunger for wealth. Still, in that fragile space between chaos and order, Tortuga flourished. It became a symbol, proof that the oppressed could build something of their own, even if it was carved in blood and smoke. For nearly a generation, Tortuga stood as the heart of a growing pirate world, a society of outlaws bound not by law, but by choice. its ports filled with the languages of every nation, its taverns echoed with songs of mutiny and survival. To the European elite, it was a nightmare. To the common man, it was legend. And from this island of fugitives, a storm would spread across the Caribbean, one that would give birth to names still whispered centuries later: Blackbeard, Calico Jack, and Bonnie, Charles Vane. They would take the spirit of Tortuga, the idea of equality, rebellion, and defiance, and carry it to the open sea. The Caribbean was no longer a battleground for kings. It was becoming something far greater, a war between the powerful and the free. 3. The Golden Age of Piracy. By the dawn of the 18th century, the Caribbean had changed. Tortuga's smoke still lingered in the air, but the world beyond it was shifting fast. The great empires, Spain, England, and France, had drained the seas with endless wars. Their soldiers were exhausted. Their navies stretched thin. Their colonies, ripe, wealthy, and vulnerable, stood like ripe fruit waiting to be plucked. And into that fragile silence came the pirate. From the Bahamas to Jamaica, the Caribbean erupted with chaos. Ships that once flew the flags of nations now hoisted black banners. Ports that had once belonged to kings became pirate havens. And among them all, one name echoed across the waves: Nassau. On the island of New Providence, Nassau became the new Tortuga, bigger, louder, and far more dangerous. It was a city of broken men and dreamers, deserters and ex-slaves, all living under one banner: the Black Flag. Unlike the world they'd escaped, Nassau was built on equality. Every ship that docked there was its own republic, every crew a democracy of rebels. Captains were elected. Plunder was shared. Even punishments were voted upon. For men who'd been nothing but tools of empire, this was liberation. Here, a beggar could rise to command a ship. A woman could wear a sword and command fear. And a man of any color could stand as an equal beside his crew. To the empires, it was anarchy. To those who lived it, it was the closest thing to freedom the world had ever seen. This was the golden age of piracy, a brief, burning moment between 1690 and 1730 when the Caribbean's waves belonged to no king. And among those waves sailed legends. There was Edward Teach, known to the world as Blackbeard, a towering figure with smoke woven into his beard, striking terror without ever needing to fight. He understood something profound, that fear was power. The mere sight of his ship, Queen Anne's Revenge, sent entire fleets fleeing. Yet beneath his monstrous reputation, Teach was deliberate, a tactician who avoided unnecessary bloodshed. He ruled by theater, not slaughter. Then came Charles Vane, the defiant madman of Nassau, a pirate who refused all treaties, burning ships rather than surrendering to any crown. He believed that compromise was betrayal, that piracy was not just survival, but defiance itself. Vane was the fire that could never be tamed, and like all fire, he burned everything around him. And then there were Bonnie and Mary Red, two women who shattered every rule of the age. And, born to scandal in Ireland, and Mary, who had lived disguised as a man for years, met aboard Calico Jack Rackham's ship. Together, they defied the entire structure of society, fighting, raiding, and surviving as equals among men who'd once sneered at the idea of a woman at sea. Their existence was proof that piracy, for all its brutality, offered something the civilized world never did: the chance to define one's own life. Each of them became myth, their stories tangled in rumor and truth. But together they built something that terrified the old world. Their ships were floating revolutions, small, self-governed republics operating outside every known system of power. They banned slavery on their deck. They shared everything down to the last coin. And they made decisions by vote, not command. They lived and died by their own code. In an era when kings ruled by divine right, this was heresy. Yet for decades it worked. The Caribbean's trade routes choked under the black flag. Merchants begged for naval escorts. Governors sent pleas to London, warning that the pirates are becoming a nation unto themselves. And they were right. Pirates began calling themselves brotherhoods of the coast. They sailed from Nassau, Tortuga, and Madagascar, creating a loose but powerful network, a shadow empire that traded goods, intelligence, and allegiance without borders. For a fleeting moment, the world's oceans were not ruled by empire, but by equality. And that frightened kings more than any cannon ever could. But even revolutions at sea cannot escape human weakness. With gold came greed. With power came betrayal. As pirate fleets grew, so did the distance between the ideals they preached and the lives they led. Some captains turned tyrant. Others surrendered to the promises of royal pardon, trading their black flags for clean slates. Nassau itself began to rot from within, filled with spies, informants, and fear. Still, for those who lived through it, the Golden Age was more than plunder. It was proof that for all their flaws, for all their bloodshed and brutality, ordinary men and women could build a world of their own. It wouldn't last. Empires never forget, and freedom, once tasted, never goes unpunished. But before the black flags fell, the pirates of Nassau would show the world something extraordinary, that even at the far edge of civilization, the human spirit will always fight to be free. And as we sail deeper into their world, we'll discover how their defiance gave rise to a code that changed everything, a code of honor among thieves that echoed the earliest ideas of democracy itself. 4. The Pirate Code, Law among Thieves. For men branded as outlaws, the pirates of the Caribbean lived by more law than the kings who condemned them. They had no parliaments, no courts, no thrones, only a few sheets of paper, stained with salt and blood, nailed to the mast of a ship. This was their law, the Pirate Code. It wasn't legend. It was real. Written, signed, and sworn by every crew member before the first sail was raised. Each ship had its own version, but all shared one radical truth. Equality was the only king aboard. Every pirate, from the captain to the cabin boy, was bound by it. Disobedience meant punishment. Betrayal meant death. But within its lines was something astonishing, a blueprint for fairness that the so-called civilized world had never offered. Loot was divided equally. Shares were distributed by rank, but no man went hungry while another grew rich. The captain received 2 shares, sometimes 3, but never more. Even the injured were paid. If a man lost a leg, an arm, or an eye in battle, he received compensation before anyone else touched a coin. They called it Articles of Agreement, a phrase that sounded more like a contract than rebellion, because that's exactly what it was. Before each voyage, the crew would gather on deck, circle around the captain, and read the articles aloud. Each man signed his name or his mark beneath them. It was a solemn ritual, part democracy, part defiance. No one was forced to serve. If you didn't agree, you could leave. No chains, no press gangs, no lashes. 4 sailors who had endured the cruelty of naval captains. This was a revelation. The Royal Navy ruled through terror. Officers feasted while the crew starved. Whips cracked across backs for the smallest offense. But aboard a pirate ship, respect was earned, not demanded. The captain had authority only in battle. The rest of the time, the quartermaster, elected by the crew, held power. He managed supplies, discipline, and dispute. He could overrule the captain, even strip him of command if the crew voted to do so. Imagine that, in an age of divine kings, slaves, and colonies, men branded as villains practiced democracy on the open sea. It was imperfect, yes. Their world still burned with greed and violence, but it was a kind of justice born from necessity. They had lived under tyranny so long that they built its opposite. The code governed everything: how treasure was divided, how disputes were settled, how discipline was maintained. If two men fought, they didn't draw swords. They dueled on a deserted island, pistols at dawn, overseen by their peers. If a man stole from the common chest, he was marooned, left on a sandbar with a bottle of rum and a pistol. Their punishments were brutal, but so was their world. In truth, the code wasn't meant to make them saints. It was meant to make them survive. Because without it, a pirate crew would eat itself alive. Too much power in one man's hands led to mutiny, too little to chaos. The code kept balance, an invisible line between freedom and destruction. What's remarkable is how these laws echoed across history. Centuries later, historians and political thinkers would look back and see the faint outlines of something modern: self-governance, labor rights, even early forms of social contract. A pirate ship, for all its blood and brutality, was a society of agreement. They voted on their captains, they shared their wealth, they punished corruption. They were everything the empires pretended to be, and everything they feared becoming. When royal navies hunted them, they didn't just see criminals. They saw a dangerous idea. An idea that men could rule themselves. It terrified them more than any cannon. The black flag was not just a warning of death. It was a symbol of independence. A declaration that the sea belonged to those brave enough to live without masters. But ideas, like storms, cannot stay contained forever. And soon, the wind that carried these codes of freedom would reach those who'd been silenced the longest: women, slaves, and outcasts. They, too, would claim their share of the pirate's dream. 5 women, outcasts, and the forgotten. History remembers the pirates as monsters, bearded men with pistols, violence, and rum. But the truth is far more complex. Beneath the chaos and cruelty, piracy was also a refuge, a place where those unwanted by the world could rewrite who they were. The decks of pirate ships became sanctuaries for society's rejects. Runaway slaves, indigenous survivors, orphans, escaped servants, and women who refused to kneel to men's laws, they all found a strange, brutal kind of equality on the sea. For some, it was vengeance. For others, survival. But for all, it was freedom. Let's begin with the women, those who defied everything their world told them to be. In the 18th century, a woman's life was not her own. She could not vote, could not own property, could not even travel alone. Her role was to obey: father, husband, king. But the ocean had no patience for such rules. And a few women, bold, clever, furious, saw in piracy something they'd never been offered on land: equality through danger. The most famous were Anne Bonny and Mary Red. And was born in Ireland, the illegitimate daughter of a wealthy man and his servant. When her family's shame grew too heavy, she fled to the Caribbean, marrying a sailor who soon disappointed her with his cowardice. In Nassau, she met Calico Jack Rackham, a charismatic pirate with gold in his teeth and rebellion in his heart. Together, they stole a ship, raised the black flag, and vanished into the horizon. But Anne did not sit quietly in the captain's cabin. She fought beside the men, sword drawn, fearless, brutal. Those who sailed with her said she was fiercer than most, her voice cutting through battle like thunder. Then came Mary Read, born in disguise, raised as a boy by a desperate mother, and living most of her life pretending to be a man to survive. Mary had fought in armies, served on ships, and escaped poverty again and again. When fate brought her to Rackham's crew, she and Anne became inseparable, kindred spirits who refused to be what society demanded. The legend says that when their ship was finally captured by the Royal Navy, the crew begged for mercy. But Anne and Mary stood on deck, pistols blazing, the last two fighting while the men hid below. When sentenced to hang, both revealed they were pregnant. The court, bound by law, delayed their execution. Mary died in prison, and disappeared, her fate uncertain, her legend immortal. They were not anomalies. They were proof that piracy, for all its cruelty, offered a kind of equality found nowhere else. On land, they would have been imprisoned or erased. At sea, they were free, feared, respected, and remembered. But it wasn't only women who found liberation under the black flag. For thousands of enslaved Africans, piracy offered something even more radical: humanity. The Caribbean was the heart of the slave trade. Every empire profited from it. Plantations ran on blood and chains. But aboard a pirate ship, color mattered less than courage. Many pirate crews accepted freedmen and escaped slaves as equals, giving them full shares of plunder, a staggering act in an age built on racism. One of the most remarkable was Black Caesar, an African man who'd escaped enslavement and joined Blackbeard's crew. He became one of Teach's most trusted lieutenants, commanding men, raiding ships, and living as free as any pirate captain. When he was finally captured, Caesar refused to beg. He died by the same code he lived by: defiant, unbroken, unowned. These stories shatter the myth of pirates as simple villains. Yes, they killed. They stole. They terrorized the seas. But they also lived by principles that the world ashore had yet to imagine. Where empires enforced hierarchy, they practiced equality. Where kings enslaved, they offered freedom, even if only to those brave enough to seize it. Of course, their world was not perfect. Racism still lingered, and greed often tore equality apart. But for the first time in modern history, there existed a society where your birth, your gender, and your color did not define your worth. That was the real revolution, one the world refused to see. Imagine the terror this struck into the hearts of governors and merchants. Their power depended on obedience, on the belief that freedom was a privilege, not a right. But here were living examples: sailors, slaves, women, proving that freedom was possible, even if it came on the edge of a blade. The Caribbean had become more than a battleground for gold. It was now a battleground for ideas. And when ideas threaten empires, the response is always the same. The kings would strike back, not only with cannons but with propaganda. They would turn these rebels into monsters. They would erase their ideals and leave behind only myth: the drunken pirate, the parrot, the chest of gold. Because if people remembered what the pirates truly stood for, equality, autonomy, rebellion, then the empires would crumble from within. And so, as the Brotherhood of the Sea reached its greatest heights, the noose began to tighten. The age of freedom was ending. The empire's revenge was coming. 6. The empires strike back. By the 1720s, the world's empires had had enough. 4 decades, the Caribbean had been theirs in name only. Their trade routes, strangled. Their colonies, terrified. Their kings, humiliated by men who owned nothing but courage and salt. The pirates had become a plague on the sea. But more dangerously, they had become an idea. And ideas are far harder to kill than men. At first, the empires tried to ignore them. They sent fleets, made arrests, hung a few unlucky captains. But for every pirate they executed, 2 more appeared. The black flag had become a symbol, a whisper of defiance that spread through the taverns and harbors of the New World. But by 1718, England's patience was gone. King George I issued the Proclamation for Suppressing of Pirates, a royal decree offering a choice: amnesty for those who surrendered, or death for those who didn't. At first, it worked. Some pirates accepted the king's pardon, trading freedom for safety. Others, like Benjamin Hornigold, even became pirate hunters, hunting the very men they once called brothers. But many refused. For them, surrender was a kind of death far worse than hanging. And so, the great manhunt began. Royal navies and privateers joined forces. They hunted the seas with new vigor, not for plunder, but for extermination. Nassau, once a republic of the free, became a trap. The age of rebellion was turning into the age of reckoning. The most feared hunter of all was Woodes Rogers, the newly appointed governor of the Bahamas, a former privateer who knew pirates better than anyone. Rogers arrived in Nassau with soldiers, gallows, and a simple motto carved into his orders: piracy expelled, commerce restored. Within weeks, the black flags were torn down. Those who accepted his pardon were spared. Those who resisted were dragged through the streets and hanged. Their bodies were left in cages as warnings, swaying in the salt air, eyes hollow, bones bleached by sun and time. One by one, the icons of the Golden Age began to fall. Charles Vane, the untamed firebrand of Nassau, was captured after months on the run. He refused to beg. When the hangman placed the noose around his neck, Vane's final words were a curse, not on his captors, but on any man who would ever call himself a king. Then came Blackbeard. Edward Teach, the ghost of the Caribbean, had built his legend on fear. But even legends die. In 1718, he was cornered off the coast of North Carolina by Lieutenant Robert Maynard of the Royal Navy. The battle was short, savage, and bloody. Teach was shot 5 times, stabbed more than 20. He fell with his sword still raised, his body collapsing into the water that had been his kingdom. Maynard severed his head and hung it from his ship's bow, a trophy, a warning, a statement. With that single act, the age of fear ended, and the age of silence began. But what the empires didn't realize was that by killing Blackbeard, they had killed a man, not the myth. His story, and those of Mbani, Mary Red, and countless others, would live on, growing larger with each retelling. Still, in those years the sea grew quiet. The black flags disappeared from the horizon. The taverns of Nassau fell into ruin. The dream of a world without masters was slipping beneath the waves. Yet for all their victory, the empires were haunted. They had won the war, but they couldn't erase the question the pirates had asked: what if people could rule themselves? That question would echo through time, from the slave revolts of the Caribbean to the revolutions of America and France. The pirates had lit a fire, and though the kings had drowned the men, they could not drown the idea. Back then, though, in the early 18th century, no one knew that. All anyone saw were the gallows, and the end of an age. On the docks of Port Royal and Kingston, the bodies of the last pirates swayed in cages, iron creaking in the wind. Children were made to look upon them as warnings. Merchants prayed. Governors smiled. And far out at sea, where the waters darkened and the world grew silent, the ocean kept its secrets. Because not all who sailed under the black flag were caught. Some disappeared, vanishing into fog and rumor, carrying the last sparks of freedom across the horizon. The empire believed it had crushed piracy. But history has a way of hiding its rebellions, and soon whispers began to spread, of lost colonies, secret islands, and a dream that refused to die. The age of pirates was over, but their legend was only beginning. 7. The last pirate havens. When the gallows emptied the Caribbean and the sea grew quiet, the world assumed piracy was dead. But legends don't die, they drift. And the wind carried the last whispers of the black flag far beyond the Caribbean horizon. Those who escaped the hangman scattered across the world's oceans. Some disappeared into anonymity, hiding in port towns, taking false names, marrying into the very societies they once defied. Others fled east, chasing rumors of untouched islands and hidden freedom. Their ships, battered and scarred, became ghosts in the trade winds. Among them were captains and crew who had lost everything, their comrades, their havens, their cause. They were not ready to surrender to kings. So they vanished into the Indian Ocean, to the coast of Africa, and to islands whispered about in sailors' tales. Madagascar, Isle Sainte Marie, and a place that existed somewhere between truth and imagination, Libertalia. Libertalia. A name that sounds like fantasy, yet has haunted maps and minds for centuries. The story goes that it was a settlement founded by pirates who refused to die as criminals. They sailed east, led by a mysterious captain, sometimes called Misson, sometimes two, sometimes both, and built a utopia on the shores of Madagascar. There, they said, no man was slave or master. Every race, every creed, every soul who fled tyranny could live as equals. Gold was meaningless, labor was shared, and decisions were made by vote. They called their home Libertalia, the land of the free. Historians have debated for centuries whether it truly existed. No ruins have ever been found, no documents proven authentic. Some say it was only a sailor's dream, a story told in rum-soaked taverns to keep hope alive after the Caribbean fell. But perhaps in a way it doesn't matter, because even if Libertalia never existed, the idea of it did. And ideas, like the sea, are impossible to contain. The myth of Libertalia became the pirates' afterlife, their resurrection in story and spirit. It was proof that the dream hadn't been buried with Blackbeard or drowned in Nassau's harbor. That somewhere, beyond the reach of empires, freedom still lived. And while most pirates who fled east likely met quieter fates, traders, mercenaries, smugglers, some truly did carve out small enclaves along Africa's coast. They married local women, blended cultures, and formed strange new communities, half African, half European, united by a shared disdain for the crowns of Europe. These were the last pirate havens, small, secret, and fleeting. Their ships rarely flew the black flag anymore. But the code, that unspoken law of equality, brotherhood, and defiance, lived on. In time, the empires would come for them too. Madagascar became a colonial prize. The Indian Ocean, once wild, fell under British control. The age of empires had completed its circle. The oceans that had birthed rebellion were now policed by iron and empire. Yet, in the margins of history, Libertalia survived, not in maps but in the imagination. Writers began to weave it into their tales. Sailors spoke of it as if it were a paradise waiting beyond the horizon. Philosophers later pointed to it as the first whisper of anarchism, a world without rulers, bound only by shared will. In this way, the pirates won something greater than gold. They won immortality. Because while the kings who hanged them are forgotten, their legend has only grown. Even now, the word pirate doesn't just mean thief, it means rebel, dreamer, exile. It means the refusal to kneel. The myth of Libertalia was never about geography, it was about hope. Hope that one day humanity might live as equals. Hope that power could be challenged, even from the deck of a stolen ship. It was that same hope that echoed centuries later in revolutions, uprisings, and songs. The pirates had not built nations, but they had shown the world that nations could be defied. Somewhere, perhaps, a few survivors really did make it to that lost coast, building small colonies that vanished with time. Perhaps the waves washed them away. Or perhaps the story was true, and Libertalia still lies buried beneath the jungles of Madagascar, its flag of freedom faded but not forgotten. Either way, what mattered most was not what they built, but what they proved. That in an age of kings, it was possible, even for the damned, to live without one. The black flag had fallen, but its shadow stretched far. And beneath that shadow, the modern world was beginning to awaken, inspired, unknowingly, by those it once called monsters. Because the end of piracy was not the end of rebellion. It was merely its transformation. And under the calm surface of the Caribbean, and in the whispered tales of Libertalia, the seeds of revolution were quietly taking root. 8. The legacy beneath the waves. The sea never forgets. Even when silence falls, it remembers. Beneath the turquoise waters of the Caribbean, history sleeps, wooden ribs of ships rotting in the sand, cannons rusted, coins scattered like stars across the ocean floor. Each relic tells a story, not of greed, but of defiance. Because buried under centuries of myth lies something far more human, a lost experiment in freedom. Divers still find fragments of that forgotten age, a musket ball here, a gold earring there, a length of chain half buried in coral. Some of it is treasure. Most of it is tragedy. But all of it whispers the same truth, that the pirates of the Caribbean were not just criminals, they were the first rebels of the modern world. Their revolution was short-lived, brutal, and doomed. Yet its echoes are everywhere. When we speak of equality, of democracy, of rights earned rather than given, we echo the voices of those who once stood barefoot on a ship's deck, signing the pirate code by torchlight. When we raise our voices against injustice, we invoke that same defiance, the courage to live outside the laws of tyrants. Because long before the American colonies spoke of liberty, pirates practiced it. Long before the French Revolution cried equality, the decks of outlaw ships had already lived it. They were no saints, they killed, they stole, they destroyed, but in the chaos of survival, they stumbled upon one of humanity's greatest truths, that power, left unchecked, devours freedom. The irony is that the world they defied eventually adopted their ideals. The empires that once hanged them later preached democracy. The monarchies that condemned their anarchy became nations built on the same principles they once feared: equality, shared rights, and elected power. The pirates, in their violent, imperfect way, had been centuries ahead of their time. Even their symbols survive. The Jolly Roger, once a flag of terror, became one of the most recognized emblems in human history, a mark of rebellion against authority. From rock bands to political movements, hackers to protesters, its skull and crossbones still fly wherever people defy control. It is a reminder that even outlaws leave legacies. But not all legacies are carved in flags. Some live in the stories we tell. Centuries after the last pirate was hanged, the world resurrected them, not as rebels, but as heroes. The tales grew wilder with every telling: buried treasure, secret maps, rum, and parrots. Hollywood polished the blood off their swords and gave them charm. The monsters of empire became symbols of adventure and freedom. The irony is beautiful and cruel. The very powers that once silenced them now sell their stories. The same system that destroyed them now profits from their myth. But perhaps that's the final act of piracy, the outlaws stealing immortality from the empires that tried to erase them. Behind every romantic tale of the Caribbean, every Hollywood pirate, every painted skull, lies a quiet, uncomfortable truth. These were not just tales of adventure. They were cries for freedom. Freedom from kings. Freedom from hunger. Freedom from chains. And maybe that's why their stories still captivate us. Because deep down we recognize ourselves in them, the part of us that refuses to obey, that dreams of something more than survival, that yearns for a life without masters. We are fascinated by pirates not because they were perfect, but because they were human. They broke the rules of their world, and in doing so, they revealed its flaws. The Caribbean today is calm, its waters blue and warm. Tourists swim above the bones of men who once changed history without meaning to. They built nothing that lasted, no monuments, no nations, yet their spirit endures in something far greater: the human imagination. They proved that even the lowest among us, the forgotten, the despised, the condemned, can defy empires. They showed that freedom doesn't come from permission. It comes from refusal. Refusal to be ruled. Refusal to be broken. Refusal to forget what it means to be free. And though their bodies sank beneath the waves, their ideas rose, carried on the tides of time, washing ashore again and again whenever the world needs to be reminded that authority is never absolute. Because if you look closely, even now you can see their reflection in us, in every protest, in every act of defiance, in every whisper of rebellion. The sea keeps their memory, and the world, whether it admits it or not, still sails in their wake. For centuries, storytellers have searched for the lost treasure of the Caribbean, gold coins glimmering beneath coral, chests sealed in sand, maps marked with an X. But they've been looking in the wrong place. The real treasure was never buried. It was born in the hearts of those who dared to live free. When the pirates raised their black flags, they weren't just declaring war on kings. They were declaring independence from the very concept of power itself. Their treasure was freedom, pure, wild, and fragile. And it was that freedom, not gold, that terrified empires the most. Think about it. These were men and women who came from nothing. Slaves, soldiers, orphans, beggars, people society had used up and thrown away. Yet together they built floating republics on the open sea. They created systems of law, equality, and justice in a world ruled by tyranny. They treated one another as human beings, not as servants, not as property, not as pawns of empire. For a moment they achieved what philosophers only dreamed of, a society without kings or chains. A fleeting, salt-soaked vision of liberty. It couldn't last. Freedom rarely does when power fears it. The empires crushed them, not because they were thieves, but because they were proof that the world could be different. The gallows silenced their voices, but not their message. Each hanging was a warning, not just to sailors, but to dreamers. Do not believe you can live without masters. And yet, here we are, centuries later, still telling their stories. Still fascinated by those who refuse to kneel. Still dreaming of ships that sail beyond the horizon, where no one gives orders but the wind. Because the pirates didn't just challenge empires, they challenged human nature. They showed that equality is not given, it is seized. That justice is not inherited, it is built. That freedom, real freedom, always carries a price, sometimes paid in blood, sometimes in silence, but always paid. They lived brutally, died young, and left nothing but legends. And yet, their greatest legacy endures not in the coins they stole, but in the ideas they carried. Every democracy born since carries an echo of that rebellion, the notion that power must answer to the people, that no man's crown grants him the right to rule another. That is their treasure, not locked in a chest, but in us, in every voice that refuses to be silenced, in every hand that rises against oppression. So when we look out at the sea and wonder what remains of the real pirates of the Caribbean, the answer is simple. They never truly vanished. They became the restless part of the human spirit that refuses to obey. And maybe that's why we still romanticize them, not because they were perfect, but because they remind us of what we've lost. They remind us that freedom is always temporary, always fragile, and always worth fighting for. Their story ends in blood and betrayal, but their idea, their impossible dream of equality, still sails on. No empire, no king, no history book could sink that. Because somewhere in every heart still beats the rhythm of the waves, the whisper of the wind, and the eternal call of the sea, the same call that once told a handful of outcasts, "You don't have to kneel." The waves that once carried pirates now carry tourists and cruise ships. The ports they burned are rebuilt. The flags they flew are gone. But if you stand on a Caribbean shore at dusk, when the wind turns warm and the horizon glows red, you might still feel something, a presence, a pulse, a faint heartbeat of history beneath the calm. The sea remembers them. The world may have buried their names beneath fantasy and film, but the truth still drifts in the tide. They weren't just thieves chasing gold. They were exiles chasing meaning, desperate souls who, for a brief moment, carved equality out of chaos. They showed us that freedom is not granted by kings or government. It is taken, by those bold enough to demand it, and brave enough to pay its price. The real pirates of the Caribbean didn't leave behind maps or treasure chests. They left behind something far more valuable, a question. What would you risk to be free? It's a question that has echoed through every generation since, from revolutions and rebellions to every quiet act of defiance against injustice. Because in the end, the pirates' greatest act wasn't stealing gold from empires. It was stealing back their humanity. And maybe that's why, centuries later, we still raise their flag, in stories, in dreams, in spirit. Because some part of us still longs for what they found on those endless waves. A life without masters, a voice without fear, and the courage to live, even for a moment, on our own terms. That was the real treasure of the Caribbean.